That I really don't know. There are a lot of problems and difficulties. Inevitably, it's an awkward situation to be in.
A sealed letter, locked away since the final spring of Prince Philip's life, has resurfaced inside the palace. And what it reveals is not only a secret of inheritance, but a judgment, a warning, and a divide that now threatens the monarchy's most fragile alliances. The letter that should never have reappeared. It began on a quiet morning in early December 2025, the kind of morning when Windsor Castle feels more like a museum of ghosts than a functioning residence. The halls were cold, the light thin and pale, and the entire estate seemed suspended in a breathless stillness that comes only before something irreversible takes place. An archivist, a woman known for her rigid precision and uneventful career, was tasked with reviewing a set of personal correspondence believed to have been fully catalogued years earlier. She expected dust, routine, and the comfort of predictability. What she found instead was a sealed envelope that did not belong to any of the existing registries. A single line was written across the front in Prince Philip's unmistakable script, "For Catherine only." The discovery did not travel slowly. It shot through the internal communication chain with a velocity that startled even the most stoic officials. The archivist, trembling, delivered the envelope to her supervisor. Within minutes, it reached a senior private secretary, and shortly after that, the king's appointed household advisors were assembled in one of the smaller briefing rooms. Outside the windows, Windsor's lawns were dusted with early winter frost, but inside the room, the air was thick with dread. Everyone understood the implications. Prince Philip had left a series of sealed notes during the final winter of his life, but all had been accounted for, processed, or quietly redacted in accordance with royal protocol. This envelope should not exist, and if it did exist, it should never have resurfaced now, not when the monarchy was already straining under the weight of public scrutiny and internal fractures. When the king was handed a summary of what the archivist had inadvertently stirred to life, he read the briefing twice. The color drained from his face not because the letter itself surprised him, but because of the line contained in the description. Philip had written an explicit instruction regarding Catherine, granting her access to portions of his personal fortune. That alone would have been enough to ignite controversy within the family. But what unsettled the king most, what made him grip the edge of his desk, was the final sentence recorded in the archivist's notes. The assets in question were to be kept entirely beyond Camilla's reach, influence, or consideration. The phrasing was not ambiguous. It was sharp, decisive, and deeply personal, a boundary drawn from the grave. Within the palace, panic did not erupt loudly. It never does. Instead, it spread like a slow tightening around every corridor. Senior officials moved with the urgency of people accustomed to averting catastrophe but unsure whether this one could be contained. There were hurried meetings held in rooms that had seen scandals far older than this, and whispered debates about whether the letter should be resealed immediately or reviewed in full before Catherine was informed. Every advisor knew that if word leaked to the press that Prince Philip had deliberately excluded Camilla from his personal financial legacy, the monarchy would face a storm unlike anything in recent years. It was not merely an inheritance question, it was an indictment, a judgment preserved in ink, revealing sentiments Philip had never spoken publicly. And because he was no longer alive to contextualize it, reinterpret it, or soften it, the letter would carry the finality of a verdict. By midday, the atmosphere had grown even more charged. In recent years, digital misinformation channels have become increasingly adept at sniffing out the scent of royal secrets. Rumors had already begun circulating online about a classified document connected to Philip. No one knew how the whispers had started. Perhaps an inattentive staffer had spoken too loudly in a hallway. Perhaps a journalist had intercepted a curious shift in archival schedules. Whatever the origin, the effect was immediate. The palace sensed that time was running thin. Anne was briefed first. She listened without flinching, her expression a mask of practiced restraint. But those who knew her well recognized the flash of concern beneath her stern composure. She understood instantly that Philip's letter possessed the capacity to unravel delicate balances within the family. Philip had favored Catherine in life, that much had always been clear. but a sealed statement granting her access to his personal fortune while denying Camilla any claim or influence suggested something far more explosive. It reopened questions that the institution had spent years forcefully burying. Old loyalties, old resentments, old fears about the direction of the monarchy after the Queen's decline. William reacted differently. The mention of Catherine's name in connection with Philip's private affairs shook him deeply, not because he doubted Philip's affection for her, but because he understood what such a revelation would provoke. Catherine had already endured extraordinary public pressure following a difficult year marked by health concerns, personal strain, and relentless speculation. For her to be thrust into the center of a posthumous inheritance battle was both unfair and dangerous. William's protectiveness sharpened into a quiet fury. He demanded clarity. Who knew about the letter? Who had seen it? How likely was a leak? His questions came not from protocol, but from instinct. The instinct of a man who had learned again and again that stability is never guaranteed. Camilla, when informed, said very little. She listened, her face composed yet pale. To her credit, she did not lash out, she did not accuse, but there was a brittle stillness in her posture, a sense that something inside her had been struck. She knew the past never stays buried entirely. But she had not expected Philip's private judgment to re-emerge like this, at a moment when her position as queen consort already felt increasingly fragile under the weight of public opinion. She excused herself from the meeting with dignity, but several aides later remarked that her eyes were colder than they had seen in years. As evening settled over Windsor, a decision needed to be made. The envelope still sat unopened, its seal intact, daring the monarchy to confront its contents. Advisors argued quietly in adjoining rooms about protocol, precedent, and risk. But beneath all the procedural language was a shared truth. The letter represented more than personal instructions. It represented Philip's unfiltered assessment of the monarchy's future. And the man who had written it had always favored blunt, unsentimental clarity no matter the discomfort it caused. Outside, the winter sky darkened. Inside, the palace braced itself. The letter that should never have resurfaced had returned, and nothing about the institution would remain untouched once it was finally opened. Why Philip wrote it. The winter of 2021. The winter of 2021 settled over Windsor with a heaviness that seeped into every stone of the old castle. It was a winter of dimmed hallways, quiet infirmaries, and long pauses between conversations. Prince Philip moved through those months with the awareness of a man who understood he was nearing the end of his long and unrelenting journey. Those closest to him could see that he carried not fear, but urgency. He knew that once he left this world, silence would replace his counsel, and decisions would be made by people whose judgment he did not always trust. So he began writing, not speeches, not public reflections, private letters, some meant for Charles, a few destined for Anne, and one sealed so carefully that even decades of protocol could not mask its intent. For Catherine only. Philip had always viewed the monarchy through a lens that blended military discipline with cold pragmatism. He believed in structure, he believed in continuity, and he believed in duty even when it demanded personal sacrifice. In those final months, as the Queen's health grew more fragile and the palace became increasingly reliant on the next generation, Philip sensed shifts he did not like. He noted Charles becoming more open to influence. He noted Camilla stepping more firmly into public space, and while he was too seasoned to voice every concern aloud, he recorded them where he believed they would matter more: in writing. Catherine had earned Philip's respect long before those final days. He admired her steadiness, her refusal to seek limelight, and the way she adapted to royal life with a resilience that reminded him of the Queen in her early years. He often said privately that Catherine understood the difference between ceremony and responsibility, a distinction he felt many had forgotten. She possessed, in his view, an inner steel that could sustain the institution long after others faltered. And so, when he considered who among the younger royals might anchor the monarchy after the Queen's passing, he did not think of popularity or public charm. He thought of Catherine, because she would endure, because she would hold the line. But his choice to exclude Camilla from any connection to his personal fortune was not merely favoritism. It was history. Philip never fully accepted the role Camilla would one day hold. He was respectful in public, courteous when required, but he harbored a deep unease about the influence she had over Charles. He believed Charles was vulnerable to emotion in ways that posed risk to the institution if left unchecked. He worried that Camilla did not share his or the Queen's instinct for the long view, the view that sees past public opinion and into the stability of the crown itself. His concerns were rarely spoken aloud, but they were present in the clipped way he sometimes addressed matters involving her, and in the sternness of his expression whenever the subject of succession arose. There was another factor at play, one Philip told no one during his lifetime. He was troubled by the fracture that had grown between William and his brother. In his eyes, the unity of the younger generation was essential for the monarchy's survival, and yet he saw the fault lines widening each year. While others blamed external pressures or media speculation, Philip believed the real danger was internal. He feared that unresolved tensions would one day be exploited, and that Catherine, by virtue of her central role, would be left bearing the consequences. He wrote with the intent of protecting her from that future. Grants of personal fortune were not simply financial gestures. They were shields. They were anchors. They were the tools of a man who knew influence outlives breath. In late February of that winter, Philip sat by a window overlooking the frozen gardens of Windsor. Snow had turned the grounds into an expanse of white silence. He asked that no staff disturb him. On the desk before him lay a single sheet of heavy stationery. He took his time. Slow, controlled strokes of ink formed words that would one day ripple through the highest tiers of the family. He did not embellish. He did not soften. His tone was clear, almost severe. He articulated his admiration for Catherine's dedication. He made explicit his wish that she be granted access to specific portions of his personal holdings, resources built over many decades with disciplined investments and private trusts. And then he wrote the line that would one day shake the palace. Camilla was to have no claim, no access, no influence. His reasoning was brief but unequivocal. He trusted Catherine to safeguard the future of the monarchy in ways he did not trust Camilla to do. When Philip finished writing, he sealed the letter with a level of care that suggested he understood exactly how volatile it would be. He placed it into the private archive himself, declining assistance. A few staff members watched him walk the corridor slowly, his posture still upright but marked by the weight of finality. He did not tell the Queen what he had written, not because he sought secrecy, but because he believed burdening her with a conflict she could not resolve was unnecessary. He had spent a lifetime making difficult choices so she would not have to. This, he believed, was his last. As winter edged toward spring, Philip's strength diminished. Hospital stays became more frequent. Public appearances became rare. But even in those weakened moments, he showed flashes of the iron that had defined him. He spoke little about his private letters, but the staff who attended to him sensed he felt a measure of peace, knowing his thoughts had been preserved. He trusted that those who needed to find them would find them when the time was right. No one, not even Philip himself, could have predicted that the right time would arrive 4 years later in the most inconvenient and explosive way imaginable. But the seeds were planted in that winter. The choices were made in quiet rooms beneath low clouds, and the forces he had tried to prepare the monarchy against were already gathering beyond the horizon, waiting to turn his sealed words into a storm. The discovery, how one sealed envelope sparked alarm in 2025. The rediscovery of the letter did not merely unsettle the institution. It destabilized the palace in a way that felt both eerily familiar and entirely unprecedented. By the first week of December 2025, Buckingham Palace had already been operating under a subdued tension. The king's health required continuous monitoring, the public scrutiny was sharpened by recent controversies, and the family itself was carefully balancing appearances of unity with the private strain of unresolved conflicts. Into that fragile equilibrium, the sealed envelope arrived like a silent detonation. By the morning after its discovery, The letter had become the palace's most tightly guarded secret. Only a select circle had been informed, and even they were given the briefest summaries rather than the full contents. Confidential meetings were scheduled hastily in the smaller drawing rooms, the ones reserved for discussions that could not risk echoing through the larger corridors. Outside, London was dusted with the early signs of winter, but inside the palace a coldness lingered that had nothing to do with the weather. Every advisor sensed they were standing at the edge of something that could unravel years of strategic narrative control. Anne arrived first to the morning briefing. Her footsteps were brisk, her expression controlled, but her eyes betrayed a storm of calculations. When the lead advisor explained that the envelope bore Prince Philip's handwriting, that it was addressed exclusively to Catherine, and that it contained instructions regarding his personal fortune with explicit restrictions placed upon Camilla, Anne's reaction was a slow exhale that spoke more truth than any verbal response could. She knew immediately that this was not a matter of inheritance but of legacy. Philip had spoken from the grave, and in doing so had reopened a divide within the family that had never fully healed. William entered moments later and took a seat without waiting for formalities. His posture was stiff, his jaw tight. When the outline of the letter was read aloud, he listened with a stillness that bordered on dangerous. No one needed to ask what he was thinking. He viewed Catherine not just as his wife, but as the calm center of a turbulent institution. The idea that she was now at the heart of a posthumous directive involving Philip's fortune and Camilla's exclusion ignited a protective fury he struggled to conceal. His first question was blunt. Has Catherine been told? The advisors exchanged glances before explaining that they wanted to understand the implications fully before approaching her. William disagreed. He rarely raised his voice, but the sharpness of his tone left no doubt that he considered the delay unacceptable. Camilla was informed separately. She preferred it that way, perhaps anticipating that the news would demand steadiness she did not want the others to witness. When the advisor explained the key detail, that Philip had expressly barred her from involvement or influence in the assets he designated for Catherine, she reacted with a stillness so complete it seemed unnatural. She did not speak for several seconds. When she did, her voice carried an unsettling calm. "Are you certain the letter is authentic?" The advisor nodded. Camilla closed her eyes briefly, as though bracing against an old and familiar wound. She thanked the staff, dismissed them, and remained seated long after they left. Anyone watching might have assumed she was collecting herself, but those who understood her would have recognized something else: calculation, a quiet assessment of how easily public perception could swing against her if this letter ever reached beyond palace walls. As the day unfolded, the crisis grew sharper. That afternoon, the digital analysis team requested an urgent briefing. Their findings were alarming. Several fringe online channels had begun circulating cryptic claims that a sensitive document connected to Philip had surfaced inside the palace archives. No details were provided, but the timing was too close to be coincidence. Someone, somewhere, had sensed a shift. And in an age where suspicion spreads faster than fact, the palace could not afford even a whisper of scandal involving inheritance and favoritism among senior royals. The advisors debated behind closed doors whether to reseal the envelope and return it to the archive, pretending it had never been discovered. But that option evaporated the moment one of the high-level confidential couriers reported that an international tabloid had submitted a formal inquiry about a rumored internal document implicating the Queen Consort. They did not mention Philip by name. They did not mention Catherine. Yet the implication was unmistakable. The outside world was circling. As evening approached, William and Anne met privately in one of the less frequented reading rooms. The conversation was tense but necessary. Anne insisted that the family must confront the issue directly, rather than allow speculation to control the narrative. William agreed, but emphasized that protecting Catherine was the only priority that mattered. He knew how the public would interpret Philip's words if they were ever revealed. They would not see the complexity or the history. They would see a comparison, and Catherine would be dragged into a conflict she had never sought and did not deserve. The palace's internal machinery began moving at full force. Legal teams were mobilized to assess the implications of Philip's instructions. Communications advisors drafted emergency contingency statements in case the letter leaked. Archivists were instructed to provide a complete audit of any additional documents that might contain explosive revelations. Every department sensed the urgency. Every department feared the same outcome. A posthumous declaration from one of the most respected members of the royal family had resurfaced, and its content cut directly through the fault lines of the institution. By nightfall, the letter remained unopened, its seal still intact, sitting inside a secured lockbox under guarded supervision. But even without reading the full text, the palace understood what had been set in motion. One sealed envelope had shifted the balance of power. One sentence inside it had resurrected historical tensions, and the monarchy, already strained, was now bracing for a reckoning it had long believed it had outrun. Inside the letter, what Prince Philip actually wrote. The letter was finally opened on a muted afternoon in early December 2025, inside a windowless room beneath Buckingham Palace, where the most sensitive documents were traditionally reviewed. Only 4 people were present: a senior legal advisor, the King's private secretary, Anne, and William, who insisted on being there despite objections that it was not customary. The envelope lay on the table like a relic unearthed from a forgotten era, its edges yellowed, its wax seal bearing the imprint of a man whose authority had not diminished with death. When the seal cracked, it echoed faintly in the dead silence of the room. The legal advisor unfolded the single sheet of ivory paper with the cautious reverence one would reserve for a live charge. Philip's handwriting was unmistakable, firm, controlled, completely free of hesitation. Even in his final winter, he had written with the certainty of a man who had made up his mind long before putting pen to paper. The letter began without sentiment. Philip was not a man who indulged in poetic farewells or emotional overtures. He wrote as he lived, with clarity sharpened by discipline. He began by acknowledging that he understood his time was limited. He wrote that the monarchy would soon be confronted with a season of transition more complicated than any it had faced in the 21st century. He noted that the Queen's health was declining, that tensions within the younger generation posed risks, that the institution was entering a period of vulnerability in which the decisions of a few would determine the stability of the whole. Then he shifted to Catherine. His tone changed almost imperceptibly. It lost its military sharpness and adopted something closer to respect, even admiration. He wrote that Catherine had proven herself to possess the qualities essential to the endurance of the crown: composure under strain, loyalty without self-interest, a sense of duty not governed by ambition, but by purpose. He listed, with the precision of a commander citing his strongest officer, the moments he believed she had upheld the monarchy in ways few had publicly recognized: the quiet interventions, the steady presence during the Queen's most fragile years, the influence she had exercised not by demanding attention but by calming storms others had stirred. The heart of the letter came next, expressed in a single sentence that would change everything. I therefore designate that Catherine shall have access to the portion of my personal fortune held in private trusts and investments accumulated prior to my accession as consort. The legal advisor paused after reading this line aloud, allowing its weight to settle into the room. William inhaled sharply but said nothing. Anne closed her eyes briefly, as though recognizing something she had suspected but had never been certain of. Philip continued. His instructions were not vague. He outlined which holdings he referred to: all personal assets unrelated to sovereign wealth or crown estate funds. He emphasized that these provisions were made because he believed Catherine would use them with discretion, integrity, and an understanding of the responsibilities attached. He wrote that the resources were to serve not as luxury, but as reinforcement. Tools, as he called them, for a woman whose future burden he foresaw clearly. And then came the line that turned the letter from a private directive into a looming crisis. These assets are to remain entirely beyond the reach, influence, or claim of Camilla, now or at any future time. The wording was deliberate, almost surgical. Philip was not accusing, he was deciding, drawing a boundary that extended beyond death. His reasoning followed immediately after. He wrote that while he respected Camilla's companionship to Charles, he did not trust the stability of her judgment in times of institutional strain. He feared that her influence could pull the monarchy toward decisions rooted in emotion rather than duty. He worried that the crown under Charles and Camilla might drift from the discipline that had preserved it through wars, scandals, and upheavals. Philip's candor deepened. He wrote bluntly that he had spent decades watching the monarchy survive only because certain individuals placed the institution above themselves. He believed Catherine was one of those individuals, and he believed she needed protection not from the public, but from the shifting tides within the family itself. He hinted at the fractures between William and his brother, calling them a danger that could be exploited for years to come. He warned that Catherine would stand at the center of those fractures simply because she represented the future of continuity. Then he addressed William directly. The letter was meant for Catherine, but Philip added a message he assumed she would share with her husband. Protect her, strengthen her position, trust that she sees further than most, and remember that the crown survives only when its guardians are chosen for their discipline, not their popularity. There was one final paragraph, quiet, razor sharp. Philip wrote that he made these decisions with full awareness of how they might be interpreted. He did not care. He had lived too long and seen too much to soften the truth for the sake of comfort. History, he wrote, will judge all of us, but I leave this world knowing I have judged clearly. The room remained silent long after the legal advisor finished reading. No one moved. No one breathed deeply. It was as though the walls themselves understood the gravity of what had been revealed. Philip had spoken from the past with the authority of a man who refused to let time dilute his judgment. And now that judgment sat exposed on the table, poised to reshape alliances, ignite resentments, and reopen wounds the monarchy had spent years suturing in secrecy. The letter was folded again, placed back into the lockbox, and sealed. But its contents were no longer contained. They had taken root, and nothing ahead for the royal family would unfold without the shadow of Philip's final words. The palace erupts. Charles and Camilla confront the fallout. The hours following the reading of the letter unfolded with a quiet ferocity that only those inside Buckingham Palace could sense. The walls did not tremble. The corridors did not fill with shouts. Instead, the crisis spread in low voices, clipped exchanges, and the unmistakable tension of a family forced to confront the truth of a man who could no longer defend or revise his own words. By early evening, the king was summoned to receive a full briefing. His advisors approached the task with an unease bordering on dread, for they knew this revelation would strike him not as a matter of legal complexity, but as a deeply personal wound. Charles listened as the private secretary recited the heart of Philip's instructions. He did not interrupt. He did not even look away. But as the summary reached the sentence denying Camilla any access or influence over the designated portion of Philip's personal fortune, something in the king's expression tightened. He sat back slowly, clasping his hands together, as though anchoring himself against an impact he had anticipated but hoped never to face. Philip had always been direct in his assessments, sometimes painfully so, but Charles had believed that with time the old tensions had softened. Hearing otherwise shook him in a way that could not be hidden. Camilla arrived moments later, escorted in discreetly to avoid speculation among staff. She walked into the room with the composure of someone who had spent decades preparing for public storms, yet when she saw the king's face, her steps faltered for a fraction of a second. She lowered herself into the chair beside him, her posture upright, every movement deliberate. The private secretary repeated the essential lines from the letter. Camilla listened with an expression so restrained that it bordered on unreadable, but those who knew her recognized the faint tremor that appeared at the corner of her jaw, a sign of tension she rarely allowed to surface. When the summary ended, Camilla spoke first. Her voice was soft but steady. "So this is what he thought of me." The room fell silent. It was not a question. It was an acknowledgement, a resignation. She did not raise her voice, nor did she attempt to argue the fairness or logic of Philip's judgment. Instead, she asked a single practical question. How much of this is already known outside this room? The advisors exchanged uneasy glances. The answer was unclear. Rumors had already begun circulating online about a sensitive internal document. No details had leaked, but the proximity of the speculation to the discovery of the letter felt unsettling. Charles exhaled sharply, rubbing his forehead with his fingertips. He asked the question everyone else was too cautious to raise. What happens if this becomes public? The legal advisor spoke plainly. The monarchy would face a credibility crisis. The press would frame it as a rift between the late consort and the current queen. Analysts would dissect every known interaction between Philip and Camilla through the lens of suspicion. And Catherine, though blameless, would become the unwilling centerpiece of a narrative suggesting she was Philip's chosen successor in spirit, if not in title. William entered shortly afterward, informed that the king wanted him present. His presence altered the atmosphere immediately. He carried himself with a rigid calm that barely concealed the storm beneath. Charles looked up at him with a mix of paternal concern and political calculation. They had navigated many crises together, but this one had a weight that pressed against both their personal histories. William listened to the explanation without comment, his gaze fixed on the table. When the advisor finished, William finally spoke in a tone that startled even those accustomed to his restraint. Catherine is not to be dragged into this. Whatever happens, she must be protected. Charles nodded, though his nod held the heaviness of a man torn between loyalty to his wife and responsibility to his son's future. Camilla looked at William carefully, her expression neither antagonistic nor yielding. She understood his fear. She also understood the unspoken truth beneath his words. Catherine would emerge from this situation with public sympathy, while she herself risked becoming a target for criticism she could never respond to. The late consort's judgment was final, and no amount of explanation could soften the blow it carried. Anne joined the group, having been briefed separately. Her entrance shifted the tone once more. She was direct, practical, and immune to emotional theatrics. She stated plainly that the family could not afford division over a matter Philip had left behind, but even she acknowledged the reality no one wanted to articulate. Philip's words created a hierarchy of trust. Catherine was elevated, Camilla was dismissed, and the king was placed squarely in the middle of a conflict his father had unintentionally revived. The advisors recommended shaping a unified internal stance before confronting any external threat. But unity was proving elusive. Charles felt wounded, Camilla felt humiliated, William felt protective, Anne felt weary, and Catherine, who remained unaware of the letter's full contents, was about to be thrust into the center of a delicate political and emotional storm. As the meeting stretched into the night, the palace felt strangely smaller, as though its centuries of grandeur could not shield its occupants from the weight of one man's blunt final judgment. The letter had not only spoken, it had divided, and no one, not even the king, could predict the consequences that awaited once the outside world caught the scent of the truth. Outside, the winter wind scraped against the palace windows. Inside, the royal family confronted the reality that Philip's last words had not been buried with him. They had returned. They demanded reckoning, and the reckoning had only just begun. The statement, "How the Palace Explains the Unexplainable." By the time dawn broke over London the next morning, Buckingham Palace had already become a fortress of controlled chaos. Staff moved with the clipped urgency of people navigating a crisis without a script. Advisors were stationed in adjoining rooms. Legal experts conferred over sealed files. Communications officials drafted and redrafted language on glowing screens that flickered with the anxiety of their authors. The sealed letter, now locked once more inside its secured case, remained a quiet but pulsing center of gravity. Everyone understood that the monarchy stood at a crossroads. If the document leaked in full, Philip's private judgment would fracture the public image of unity with a force no statement could contain. If the palace spoke too forcefully, the public would demand to know what, exactly, they were trying to hide. In the small briefing room where the royal family gathered for the first crisis meeting of the day, the tension was palpable. William sat beside Anne, leaning forward with folded hands, his mind already parsing the implications of every potential response. Camilla entered with the poise of a woman who had weathered storms before, but who now carried the added weight of humiliation she was determined not to display. Charles arrived last, his face drawn with exhaustion, the kind that comes not from sleeplessness, but from realizing that a father's words can wound a son even after death. The advisors presented three possible strategies. The first was silence, a refusal to acknowledge any rumors, no matter how loud. But that option was dismissed almost immediately. Silence, they warned, would be interpreted as confirmation. The second option was denial, a statement asserting that no such document existed, that all reports of inheritance conflict were unfounded. But this was too risky. If the letter later surfaced through a leak, the monarchy would suffer a credibility collapse from which it might not recover. The third option was the only viable one, a controlled acknowledgement. A statement that would address the existence of private correspondence while firmly steering attention away from its contents. Charles listened quietly, then spoke with a heaviness that silenced the room. "We cannot allow my father's private reflections to become ammunition for those who seek to divide us." His voice trembled on the word father, revealing a vulnerability he rarely exposed. He looked at William, then at Camilla, and finally at Anne. "The crown depends on us holding together, even when the past refuses to stay buried." William nodded, though his agreement came with a flicker of reluctance. He knew that public unity was essential, but he also knew how quickly narratives could twist. If the statement was not crafted with absolute precision, Catherine would be thrust into a storm she neither chose nor deserved. Camilla, seated with her fingers interlaced tightly, spoke in a calm but brittle tone. "Whatever is said must protect Catherine as much as the rest of us. We cannot afford implications that paint her as the beneficiary of a division she never sought." There was grace in her words, but also unmistakable pain. Anne offered the final guiding principle. The statement must be factual, restrained, and emotionally neutral. No defensiveness, no elaboration, no window for speculation. "We handle this the same way we handle every crisis. We do not panic, we do not over-explain. We simply state what must be stated, nothing more." The drafting process took hours. Each sentence was evaluated for tone. Each phrase was tested for unintended meaning. The advisors rejected more than a dozen versions before settling on one that walked the narrowest possible line. It would acknowledge the existence of private correspondence belonging to the late Duke of Edinburgh. It would emphasize that such documents were personal and not indicative of any financial or institutional dispute. It would affirm that no current member of the royal family was engaged in inheritance conflict, and it would conclude by reaffirming unity, stability, and the family's continued commitment to duty. Shortly after noon, cameras gathered outside the palace gates. The winter sky was low and gray, pressing down on London like a lid. Journalists waited in tightly packed rows, their breath clouding in the cold air. They had sensed something significant was unfolding, though none yet understood its scale. At precisely 12:32, the palace released the statement. No live address, no televised appearance, just a single sheet of embossed paper distributed by hand to the press. The moment reporters read the opening line, the world shifted. Buckingham Palace confirms that private correspondence belonging to the late Duke of Edinburgh, recently identified through routine archival review, has led to speculation which does not reflect the current unity of the royal family. It was measured, controlled, enough to acknowledge, not enough to unravel. The statement concluded by affirming the deep respect shared among all members of the family and their continued dedication to the responsibilities entrusted to them. No names were mentioned. No further details were offered. The palace drew a line in the frost and dared the world to cross it. But inside the palace, they knew the truth. The statement had succeeded only in postponing the inevitable. Public speculation would intensify. Journalists would dig. Analysts would dissect every historical interaction between Philip, Camilla, and Catherine. And the monarchy would live for years under the shadow of a letter that had never been meant to see daylight. Catherine read the statement at home, unaware of the exact words Philip had written, but sensing their gravity from the strain etched into William's face. She did not ask for details. She simply placed a hand on his arm and said quietly, "We will face whatever comes together." And though William wished he could shield her completely, he knew she understood something the entire institution was only beginning to grasp. Philip's letter was more than a private bequest. It was a mirror held up to a family already fractured beneath the surface, and reflections once seen cannot be unseen. The monarchy had survived wars, abdications, betrayals, and scandals stretching back centuries. It would survive this too. But survival does not mean untouched, it means altered, and the alteration had already begun. In the days that followed the palace statement, the world received only fragments of the truth. Analysts debated, newspapers speculated, online channels spun their theories with the confidence of those who know they will never face accountability. Inside the palace, however, the silence spoke louder than any headline. Doors remained closed. Conversations were hushed. Trust, already delicate, grew thinner. But the letter itself remained untouched in its lockbox, resealed and secured behind layers of protocol. It would not be destroyed. It could not be. Philip's final judgments were now part of the monarchy's internal record, a stark reminder that history is shaped not only by those who rule, but by those who choose to speak when they can no longer be contradicted. Catherine moved forward with her usual grace, though the weight placed upon her had subtly increased. Charles attempted to steady the narrative. Camilla carried herself with dignity, though shadows lingered behind her eyes. And William, more than anyone, felt the pressure of a future that had been reshaped by a man who had foreseen storms none of them were yet prepared to face. The letter was sealed again, but its echo was not, and its echo would last for generations.